Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much indeed for coming along tonight, which is one of the first hustings meetings for a very, very long time in Audlem, and a big welcome from the AudlemOnline web team to you. A big welcome also to the candidates and also to our fellow websites in Tarvin and Church Minshall, who I think are also taking this broadcast or will have the opportunity to see it. We're delighted that the candidates have been able to make it. I'll introduce all 5 of them in a minute. You'll notice that I'm talking about 5 candidates, not the promised 6. I'm afraid we have 1 empty seat, and I have a statement to read out from Antoinette Sandbach. And she says, "It is with great regret that I have been unable to reach agreement with the proprietors of AudlemOnline about tonight's hustings. I have explained to the organiser that I'm willing to attend, that I'm willing to answer questions which concern people in Audlem, and I would have been willing for proceedings to be live streamed. However, I have not agreed to be part of a broadcast on the AudlemOnline website. I do not think it appropriate for a candidate who is promoting the use of illegal drugs to be broadcast by AudlemOnline, as they cannot know whether or not that broadcast is being accessed by children or other vulnerable people. In the circumstances, I have felt it best to withdraw. I made it a priority to visit Audlem after my selection and have been back since to make sure that I could speak to local people. I would have liked to have been there tonight, but understand that the decision to add Mr. Antar to the broadcast was taken in the last 2 days after 2 candidates had been consulted. I was not consulted and have made my views clear as soon as I was made aware of the position. I apologise if this has led to some disappointment, but I was not told what the true position was until today. Antoinette Sandbach, Conservative Parliamentary candidate, Eddisbury." A big disappointment certainly to us, the organisers, as this has all been planned and everybody has known what the conditions were for almost a month. But I won't say any more than that, except to say that we have had a fairly frank exchange of views. After that, can I introduce the other candidates? And we have sitting here, and I originally had them in alphabetical order of the candidates. We have George Antar, who is standing on the grounds of cannabis is safer than alcohol. And I think I should also add, and this is one of the reasons why we're delighted to have him here tonight, we think, and George thinks, that he is the youngest parliamentary candidate in the whole country standing in this general election.
18 and 3 months.
18 years and 3 months. We also have Andrew Garman of the Green Party. We have James Lang of the Labour Party.
Hello.
We have Ian Priestner of the Liberal Democrats.
Hello.
And we have Rob Millington of UKIP. And we're delighted that you could all make it tonight. Now, the format that we're going to follow is that we're going to invite the candidates to all make a statement of up to 5 minutes. We've got a timekeeper here, so the candidates will be keeping an eye on him, and if they go over the 5 minutes, I will be stopping them. The questions that we're then going to move on to have all been raised by residents and readers of AudlemOnline. By a remarkable coincidence, I counted them up this afternoon, and we've had 57 varieties of questions. I like that type of coincidence. But what we have done is we've gone through them. We've tried to cover a mixture of national and local issues. We've looked at the big issues. Where we can, we've put questions that have come from one person. In other cases, we've actually done a composite question which will reflect the views or the questions of a number of you. So, we've also drawn lots, which was done by the AudlemOnline team, which represents a variety of political opinions, to make sure this was fair. And the order we're going to go in is first Rob Millington of UKIP. So, Rob, do you want to kick us off with your opening statement?
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Before I get started, I just want to give a quick shout out. I've got 2 very good local candidates for councillor in this area who are supporting me in my campaign, and therefore I'm also supporting them. And one of them, Lisa, is here tonight. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, people of Audlem, and anyone else who may be listening in or watching this at the Lord Combermere. My name is Rob Millington and I'm the UKIP candidate for Eddisbury, and I sincerely thank you for this opportunity to speak to you all. I'll start by telling you a very little bit about myself, and then I'll talk a bit about UKIP and briefly make a mention then of how the European Union is adversely affecting matters here on the ground in Eddisbury right now. I'm a long-term resident of Eddisbury. I've lived all my life in this area, apart from some periods abroad, which I spent during my army service. And more recently, I was again working abroad, including a spell living with Iraqi Christians in northern Iraq. I've always enjoyed the countryside in Eddisbury, and I've always been fascinated by the diverse political atmosphere that this constituency presents. I mean, for instance, you talk to people and people will say things like, well, in Tarpley, people will vote for postbox as long as it's painted blue. You also hear a slightly similar opinion with regards to the people of Winsford, except this time they say the postbox needs to be painted red. Now, actually, neither of those is true. They're just broad and rather crude generalisations, and as you get speaking towards people, or rather as you get speaking to people, a lot of the time they will say, oh, well, actually, we feel like our views are taken for granted, and actually the two main political parties don't really speak for us. I've detailed a lot of these incidences on my Twitter feed. I've met young people in Winsford who have asked, what has Labour done for us? And in a similar fashion, I've encountered a large number of people who may be fairly described as long-term Conservative supporters, but who feel disillusioned and even to an extent alienated by a Conservative-led government, one which has foisted HS2 upon them to the detriment of our countryside, as well as devastating our armed forces whilst giving away increased amounts of money on foreign aid. I joined UKIP in 2008. I decided to get involved as I could see how membership of the EU was increasingly hindering the ability of government to actually deliver and address the needs of British people. In addition to which, I was incensed by the decision of the then Labour government to ratify the Lisbon Treaty, breaking a key manifesto pledge. I can discuss other pledges in detail later. I had also seen how votes in Parliament on whether or not to hold a referendum on EU membership had seen both Conservative and Labour members vote against what appeared to be and still appears to be the majority-held opinion amongst their constituents, namely that Britain should either leave the European Union or at the very least hold an open and honest referendum. Finally, therefore, it's time for me to briefly mention how some of the local issues here in Eddisbury and indeed Audlem are affected by the EU, and how by remaining inside it, good people such as yourselves cannot obtain effective redress. Take the issue of housing and the demand for more housing. We all accept the need to build more homes. This has been severely exacerbated, however, by an influx of EU immigration, the numbers of which are huge and largely unprecedented. An estimated 3 million additional persons moved to our country during the previous government. Those figures are disputed. Some figures are saying it's actually a lot more than 3 million. And that has obviously led to an increase in new houses. Approximately 300,000 is the current figure for net migration as of 2014. So it's estimated a new home needs to be built every 7 minutes. But as you are all aware, some of that is occurring on Greenbelt, and the government attempts to foster local control over planning decisions do not seem to work. As evidence, look at the recent decision to build on Little Heath nearby. Another issue is the estimated cost of £70 billion for HS2, a high-speed rail link of dubious economic value according to the House of Lords. HS2, however, in spite of what some people might say, is driven by an EU-imposed directive to link up systems across Europe, noticeably EU Directive 96/48 to be precise. As I'm also talking about with regards to the issue of immigration, I speak to people in Winsford who talk of wage depression and other matters which are caused by this issue. Now, all of the people on this panel here tonight, all of these other would-be hopeful politicians, they are all beholden to the EU and wanting to join. Now, there's a limit to what they can deliver for you, simply because they are beholden to the European Union, which is driving and influencing these decisions at the local level over which you have no control, effectively. That's all I have to say. I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and for setting a fine example in keeping on time. Can I call on Ian Priestner now, on behalf of the Liberal Democrats?
Good evening, Audlem, and thank you for inviting me here tonight. I'm Ian Priestner, Liberal Democrat candidate for Eddisbury, and I live in Tarpley. I know that over the next hour or so we'll start to dig deep into policy areas, but I thought I'd try something different. And you can have perhaps a better idea of the background of the candidates here in front of you. And I would include Antoinette in that, in virtual terms. Audlem is special to me. My parents did their courting here at the Shroppy Fly in the bleak days after the end of the war. My father actually still doing okay at 97. It was one of 5, brought up on a small tenanted farm in Warburton. And he served as a policeman for 6 years in Lim. He went on to work for 25 years in East Africa in agricultural development, in marketing boards, and came back to work in Manchester in the 70s. He was always very proud of his Cheshire farming roots in the Cheshire farming community, which continue to prosper today. The priests in the northwest, and consequently know a great deal about EU farming regulations. The first Priestons actually arrived in Cheshire from Austria in about 1580. They were ditch diggers draining Carrington Moss, and they settled in Northwich and then Tarpley, and then they spread around. My mother volunteered for the Land Army, which has been recognised only recently by the last Labour government, and was working on a farm nearby in January 1944 when she heard that her only brother had gone missing over Germany flying a Lancaster. She was herself from an artistic family. Her parents knew Lowry and Villette, and they together helped create some of the collections that we have now in the Lowry, Manchester, and so on. I was educated in Cheshire, mostly at boarding schools, including nearby Ellesmere. I left at 16, went to work, did my A-levels, lived in Moss Side, and did my A-levels at night school. And then I went to Keele University, again a local place, which changed my life. It was a social mobility in action, really. I then went to work in London. I worked at the CBI, worked for the US government, and then I ended up working for David Owen and Roy Jenkins in the 80s. And then onwards from that, I went to join the oil and gas industry, worked across the world, worked in Palestine, Israel, pipelines in South America, gas fields in Kazakhstan, and then completed a law degree at night school. So around about 2000, I came back to Cheshire, became a director at United Utilities, and really to be close to my then elderly parents, and I have a disabled brother. And when I was about 50, full-time work kind of left me, and I was unemployed. So in the teeth of a very harsh recession, and I really know what it's like to be unemployed, particularly in your 50s. So I took over childcare for our daughter from my wife, and she was working and her career was progressing. And then I just took on part-time work, which was compatible with childcare. I went to work for the Walton Hospital in Liverpool, and also in Bolton, a medical software business. And then about 4 years ago, I set up a renewables energy business, which is now providing green energy services to about 28 councils across the UK. And we employ about 30 people, and we're now currently generating about 70 gigawatts, which is about 14,000 homes in the UK get renewable energy directly from the business that we set up. So why am I standing? My passion here is that we need to grow our communities sustainably, but with very few affordable houses being built. There's about 1%, just over that in Cheshire East. We're really in danger now of designing out the young, the less well-off, and those who simply can't buy. I think also another issue here is the very, very poor broadband. I mean, we're something like in the bottom 10% in the UK for download speeds, according to a House of Commons report recently. And with about 20%, actually in Audlem it's about 40% of businesses here entirely reliant on broadband, as we all are beginning to be. I think that is really putting our community at a disadvantage. We also talked a lot about roads, impassable high streets, public transport provision. We need to redesign our towns and villages really to be able to cope, and also to provide much more cycling and walking so we can get kids back and forth from school. And the spending per head on rural populations now about 20% less than those who live in urban areas. I think we're losing out. So we need to address these, and that's why I'm here before you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Can I now call on George Antar, who's standing on Cannabis is Safer Than Alcohol? George.
Hello there. I'd like to thank you all for coming out, and I'd like to thank the organisers for allowing me to stand. I'm standing here on behalf of the single-issue Cannabis is Safer Than Alcohol party, a party founded this year and I've decided to stand in protest to our country's ridiculous stance towards drugs. In the UK, we are a 21st century country treating the issue of drugs in a medieval mindset. All over the world, countries are bringing radical reforms to drug laws, which are not only respectful of the individual, but are far more successful than prohibition ever is, was, or could be. As a world power, we should be leading the way, not being held back by our politicians and their prejudice toward drugs. All over the United Kingdom, people believe that the war on drugs can never be won, and they're right. The issue of drugs has unfortunately also become a race issue. If you live in the UK and you're black, you're more likely to be arrested for possession of cannabis, even though black people smoke no more of it than any other ethnic group. The law should be there to protect our society, and instead it oppresses us, giving young men of ethnic minorities criminal records which will do more harm to their lives than the cannabis ever could. The law is also a disaster because it not only costs us billions of pounds to uphold, but it's probably cost us skilled workers who can no longer get a job due to possession of cannabis, which is quite frankly ridiculous. If the police spent more time on the streets hunting down dangerous criminals as opposed to peaceful pot smokers, I think we would live in a safer society. There is also a medicinal case for legalisation. Under prohibition, if you overdose, the doctor cannot treat you because even you have no idea what you've taken, because many street drugs have been contaminated with adulterants. Addicts have to take their drugs in environments that aren't even habitable for human beings. They are treated like animals, and many of them are reluctant to get help because they're frightened of the criminal justice system. In Portugal, where all drugs have been decriminalised, public health has improved and the number of people taking hard drugs has gone down. Returning to the subject of cannabis, there's growing evidence that there are great medicinal benefits to cannabis, such as helping with multiple sclerosis, nausea from chemotherapy, and epilepsy, of which my mother is a sufferer. However, in the UK, doctors aren't allowed to prescribe cannabis by law, and because it's a Schedule 1 drug, we cannot even do human trials on it. Under legalisation, we can have controls. We can put age limits, health warnings, and dosage information on the products. Of course, I'm not arguing that it's a silver bullet to the problem of drugs, and no one in my party is saying it is. However, it would be a much better way than the current outdated system we have today. We've had a regulated alcohol market, and we have learnt from the mistakes we've made in the alcohol market. We need to make a regulated cannabis market to protect ourselves, reduce crime, improve public health, and make a better country for our children when they don't have to live in fear of the criminal gangs and of dangerous substances. In 2012, the Home Affairs Select Committee called for a royal inquiry into the Misuse of Drugs Act. My party sister is also calling for a royal inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Can I now ask Andrew Garman of the Green Party to address us?
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to start off by saying well done, Audlem, for organising this innovative debate. I do get tired, as I think a lot of us do, with the sterile quality of the political debate in the media. And so to have something very live and intimate here, I think is great. And I hope that hustings grow and grow in subsequent elections. I'm the Green Party candidate. I live in Ashton Hayes, right at the other end of the constituency, up at the north end. I'm a scientist by background. I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for most of my career. I was able to take early retirement in 2006, and that enabled me to try a few things, and I've settled down on two activities, one career. I'm now a counsellor or psychotherapist, which is something I love doing. And I also started to get more involved in politics, and I became a councillor on Chester City Council for 3 years until it was abolished in the reorganisation. I've been politically active since 1981, when I joined the SDP, and I've been a Liberal Democrat for most of my political life until 2010. In 2011, I decided to join the Green Party for reasons that will come apparent in a minute. So I've been a member for 4 years. That actually is a very long time in the Green Party. So about 80% of our members have been members for less than a year, a lot of them just 3 months or so. So we're a very fast-growing party. We've got 60,000 members, which is more than UKIP have got and more than the Lib Dems have got. And so it's an exciting time. Why has the Green Party struck a chord with the nation? Well, I think it's something to do with our analysis of the situation. So our policies are very different and distinctive from the rest. But that's because our analysis is different. And there are 3 things I wanted to highlight in this introduction. One is about climate change, one is about inequality in our society, and the other about democracy. So climate change, yes, the Green Party, of course, is very much worried about the state of our planet. Our economy is unsustainable, and we're treating it as if we had 3 planets. We only have 1. So totally unsustainable. Our planet will be uninhabitable unless we change drastically and reduce our carbon emissions. And as a scientist, I really have to take that very, very seriously. If we don't have a planet, we don't have anything. Secondly, inequality. I think it's become very, very clear now, certainly in the academic literature and books like The Spirit Level, that inequality is damaging for everyone in society, not just those at the bottom of the pile, which you would expect, but for everybody right up to the rich. And this is something that I think we really have to tackle. To give you a flavour of that, I thought I might just quote from the preamble of our, what do you call it? Manifesto, thanks, that's the word I was after. We're told that growth has returned to the UK. The result? More than 1 in 4 children is growing up in poverty. The bosses of the UK's 100 biggest companies earn on average 143 times more than their staff. The top 1% of the population has the same wealth as the bottom 55%. 5 families in the UK have the same wealth as 12 million UK citizens. And 913,138 people received 3 days emergency food or more from the Trussell Trust food banks in 2013. A third of them children, I understand, and that's up 3-fold from the previous year. There's other stuff here as well. So I think that there's something profoundly sick in our society. We're told by the right-wing press that it has to be like this, but I don't accept that it has to be like this because it wasn't like this before. This is something that's cropped up in the last, 30 seconds to go, in the last 30 years or so. And it isn't like this in other countries. Other countries are much more healthy. Highlight Denmark, for example, a very equal country where people are happy to pay their taxes in order to get a good quality society. And the Danes are the happiest nation in the Western world. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Can I now call on James Lang of the Labour Party?
Hello. If elected as Audlem's next Member of Parliament, I will work with local businesses, councils and the wider community, both here in Audlem and Eddisbury in general, to ensure the village develops over the coming years in accordance with the needs of residents. For example, that the neighbourhood plan that was laid out at the meeting I attended on Wednesday is implemented and that speculative developments are challenged. I'm sure that many of you have heard the policy statements from the Labour Party and our key election pledges on the economy, the NHS, education and families. And instead of dwelling on those now, I would like to outline what my commitments to Audlem and Eddisbury are. I will be a full-time MP, no paid second jobs, no directorships, no consultancy. I will hold regular surgeries without the need for an appointment, details of which I hope will be made available on your excellent website, AudlemOnline. I will have a mobile office so I can bring my surgeries to Audlem and the other villages within Eddisbury. I will be a strong voice in Parliament, ensuring that your views are heard. And as I have already mentioned, I will work with local business, community groups and local councils to ensure that Eddisbury attracts investment and jobs. I will support local objections to fracking, and I want to start a debate on how best to change our planning laws. In regard to the last pledge on planning, I want to change the way that planning consent is granted. Currently, the local community, through the Council Planning Committee, effectively awards a lottery win to the current custodian of land. Arable or fallow land can have its value increased by a factor of 50 with planning permission, but the local community does not always get to benefit. I think that's wrong. I want to look at different ways of handling planning permission, like in some European countries where only local councils can hold land with planning consents. This effectively means that councils can plan developments in their area, stopping land banking and speculative building projects. It would also remove the need to negotiate with developers under the current 106 guidelines, which lead to horse trading land in return for infrastructure and social or affordable housing commitments. It would also allow councils to acquire land for community development, such as schools, health service, transport or social housing at a sensible cost. There may be other ways of achieving what I have outlined, and I would welcome any contributions. It is about getting a discussion started on how planning can be made to work for the benefit of communities, not just landowners. Now, I believe there are real choices facing voters at this election about what kind of country we want to pass on to our children. I am concerned that the poorest and most vulnerable in our communities are being punished when they should be getting help and support. The bedroom tax and work capability assessment scheme, for example, have pushed many people already struggling into desperate straits and have not achieved anything like the savings that the government promised. In fact, the WCA scheme has 58% of sanctioned claims overturned, which clearly shows it's failing, whilst over 50% of homes affected by the bedroom tax have somebody living with a disability in them. With 12 billion of uncosted welfare cuts being promised by the Tories, I am concerned that those who need our help the most will be further punished. I don't think that poverty is self-inflicted for the vast majority of people. In many cases, people who are struggling are in work. The Labour Party, and for that matter me personally, don't think that benefits should be a lifestyle option. Far from it. The welfare system should be a safety net to help those who are trying to do the right thing but are struggling, or for those with disabilities or other conditions which exclude them from mainstream employment. The idea that closing companies such as Remploy would help the disabled integrate is just nonsense. Labour will scrap the bedroom tax. It's unfair. Labour will also reform the WCA scheme so that it helps people get back to work, instead of being a minefield designed to sanction people. The minimum wage will increase to £8 an hour by the end of the Parliament. To help young people, we will fund apprenticeships for those who get the grades and create technical baccalaureate courses to meet the needs of industry in conjunction with new technical colleges. We will also cut tuition fees by 3, 6 and 7-year-olds and not in class sizes above 30 and help working families by increasing paternal leave and free childcare for 3, 4 and 5-year-olds to 25 hours a week. On the economy, Labour is committed to including deficit reduction in every budget they present, with a surplus by the end of the Parliament. Our policies are costed and don't require extra borrowing. We will reintroduce the 50% ban for those who earn £150,000 or over, a levy on the top 0.5% of properties, and a tax on bankers' bonuses. Labour will also scrap the non-dom rule. I support Labour's policy to first cut, then freeze business rates for small to medium-sized firms. In addition, Labour is also committed to allowing local communities to keep 100% of business rates from new growth. A Labour government will scrap the Health and Social Care Act. The NHS should be about compassion and cooperation, not competition and profit. Health and social care will be integrated, and we will employ 8,000 more doctors and 20,000 more nurses. I call on you to vote Labour on May the 7th and send me as your representative to the House of Commons. Audlem deserves better, Eddisbury can be better, and Britain will be better with Labour.
James, thanks very much indeed, and we'll forgive you for going 5 seconds over. Right, we're going to turn to the questions now, and we're going to ask the candidates, and it'll be in a different order each time, to comment for up to a couple of minutes on each of them, and I'm sure for a few more minutes after that, if people want to take issue with each other amongst the candidates, they will do so. And I'm hoping that we'll spend sort of 10 minutes, quarter of an hour on each question, probably up to a quarter of an hour, and get through as many as we can. And we've tried to choose a balanced set of questions. And the first one has been raised by Bob Fusat, and it's on the NHS. All parties are advocating throwing more money at the NHS. However, is not the serious drive for a more efficient and effective service more important in ensuring that the NHS is the jewel in the crown of our nation? James, I know you've just been talking. Would you like to kick off on this one?
Well, I would definitely agree that the NHS is the jewel in the public services crown. Answer. I mean, it would be a bottomless pit. You could just forever throw money in. So I think that we do need to find savings. My background, I didn't say it in my piece, I'm a television cameraman. I don't pretend to understand how you could run the health service. I'm running for Parliament. I want to be a parliamentarian. I don't want to be in government. I want to hold government to account. I would see my responsibility in relation to the NHS as making sure that the concerns of my constituents were heard, and that the people who know how to run the NHS, the medical staff, the administrative staff there, help them to make sure that they can provide the services that we need. In terms of the Labour Party, we want to look at integrating social care and health services together, because we think they need to be more joined up. And especially, I would imagine, in rural communities, we want to bring more stuff into the doctor's surgeries, and so that more services can be got at a local level, and also can be given to people in their homes. I mean, in regard to, the main question was the cost. Yeah, I mean, as I've already said, I think that you could shovel money forever into the NHS, and the Labour Party doesn't advocate that. It advocates getting value for money. And I also, as I mentioned in my piece before, I don't think that it should be driven by profit. I think that it should be more cooperative. I think that bringing markets in would be a bad move. And the Labour Party, while it has allowed some privatisation, which I personally wish it hadn't, but it has. But what it has done is it said it will put a cap on the profits that any private companies that are involved in NHS at 5%.
Thanks, Jeff. Ian.
Well, we put in a sort of parity with with mental health, because it's really a kind of Cinderella of the National Health Service over recent years, and 1 in 4 or so people, sadly, will suffer some form of mental incapacity or illness in their lives. And I think I have, in fact, a brother who's quite severely mentally disabled, and it's really not a lot of people into a kind of waiting pattern. Some of these things are extremely urgent. Some people live in very, very bad conditions, and yet it's not been seen as a place where the government or the NHS has put money in previous years. So we want to really address that and begin to make it on a sort of at the same level, if you like. In terms of what we've done in government, we've put the 10,000 doctors in, 7,000 nurses and so on. But clearly, a lot of the issues to do with health are to do with access, issues around GP going to A&E. We have paramedics kind of getting absolutely overwhelmed. So I think there is really a policy of trying to keep people in their homes. I mean, my own parents were well into their 90s when they were still living at home, because there was a social care support. And we need to go better than that, which is to start to tie in what we do in terms of health and what we do in terms of social care. So instead of having different agencies and different branches of government trying to deal with it, we're trying to bring it much, much closer in together. And I think finally, a lot of people in this generation, and I was for a time, which was dealing with very elderly people, but also dealing with very young people. So you were kind of stretched. I had the capacity to do that, but a lot of people don't. And I come across it on the doorstep quite a lot, where people have to care when they are concerned about losing their home. So we've capped, or would cap, the social care, the care cap, which is to mean that you have £72,000 before you have to pay for it all yourself. So yeah, there's a lot more in terms of previous things. I'm really concerned about the whole PFI issue. I was quite involved in that in the recent past. I'd like to talk more about that if we have a chance.
Thanks, Ian. Can I ask Andrew?
Thank you, yes. Interesting question about efficiency. When I was in the pharmaceutical industry, I did some strategizing and talked to experts around the world looking at healthcare systems. And the NHS is actually regarded as the best value for money healthcare system in the world. Sure, it could be made more efficient, and I've got some suggestions in a second. But the reason why our health outcomes are not as good as other Western countries is that simply we don't put as much money into it. I think we're around about 8% of government expenditure, whereas most Western countries are around 12-13%. So that's by way of background, but I think we can do more. I think we can invest much more in prevention rather than cure. We tend to regard our health service as fixing us when we go wrong. particularly keen on preventative mental health, being a practitioner in that area, and we could do more about improving lifestyles. The fragmentation of the NHS, which has continued apace and privatisation will make worse, does actually make it more inefficient, and clinicians are very, very concerned about fragmented care, particularly with older people with complex conditions. I think we could do more about spreading healthcare around rather than making it so hospital-focused. Again, the indications are that we could have a more efficient system if we used local health centres much more. And finally, I would just go back to inequality. I heard a lecture by Richard Wilkinson, who wrote The Spirit Level, who showed some fantastic graphs that showed that health outcomes are actually completely unrelated, if you compare different countries, completely unrelated to how the healthcare system is organised and how much you put into it. The thing that actually dominates the quality of health in the country is inequality. So if we really want to tackle the quality of our health, then we have to tackle inequality. Gosh, timed that just right. Thank you.
Thanks, Stan. Rob?
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Thank you for your question. It's a great question. The NHS is a great institution, one of which we should be rightly proud. And it was a good achievement. I mean, it's not often that I give a shout-out to the Labour Party, but the Labour government of Clement Attlee that actually established the NHS did do a good job, I think. And I think it's right that we should have it, in spite of some of the slurs, some of the claims that we've said that we want to privatise it. It's rubbish. What we've done in our manifesto has been fully costed. And what I mean specifically when I say that is we've been quite blunt where we will take savings, we will cut spending from. For instance, 70 billion on HS2. We're not going to spend that money, so that's a lot of money, that some of which we can put towards the NHS. And we've pledged £12 billion. And that includes, we're going to recruit more nurses and more doctors. The priority has to be getting the medical experts as opposed to some of the actual consultancy type services and some of the PFI type initiatives that have been put in place, which seem to have cost the taxpayer rather a lot of money. One thing on this, and which is quite interesting, about 8 years ago, I think it was The Lancet reported that people are actually living longer. People are living longer in our country, but they're living longer often with chronic illnesses, dementia, Alzheimer's, all these sorts of things. And these, as well as cancer, of course, which we're all aware of, these are treatments that are very expensive. So that then comes down to that it's not going to be easy. We have got this extra money to put in the NHS, but it's always going to get swallowed up very, very quickly. So we need to make sure that our policy is that NHS is for a free treatment as of right for all British citizens, but it should not be an IHS, it's got to be an NHS. And that's a cold, hard fact, because there's only a certain amount of money and there's a lot of treatments that are very expensive. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. George? Rob, sorry. Now you.
That's George.
Well, the NHS is very close to me. Both my parents are nurses, and they would never have met if it wasn't for working in the health service. So, something I'm very proud of. Now, I agree that inequality is a great problem in our society, including the health service, but I don't think that's the be-all and end-all. I think another part of it is the culture. I currently study business studies, and one of the most important things of a business and a public service is the culture in which it's run. So we need to look deep and ask hard questions about the culture of the NHS and see where we can improve it and how we can improve it. I also support the democratic right of patients to be listened to when they have concerns, and to not only be listened to, but to have their views taken into account and put into reform. A sick patient who's dying affects the law when we have politicians to do that. The truth is, there are millions of patients all over the UK, but only 647 parliamentarians in the country at any one time. So I would stand behind all patients to lobby the health service to work for us, not for profit, not for political credibility, for the sick people. I also believe in the access to marijuana as a medicine, as works in America, in many states, and in Italy as well. There are many health benefits to it, and it also costs more to lock up a drug addict than it does to treat them. So, once again, I know that some of you may be annoyed that I'm talking about drugs, but it's something that has to be taken into account. The fact is, all drugs, be they illegal or illegal, should be an option for medicine, because everyone is different. Everyone needs a different form of care. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, just one quickie. I think everybody's talking about recruiting lots of nurses and lots of doctors. Has anybody got any thoughts about that's going to be a huge difficulty? We found had huge problems training those people in our own country.
Yeah, I do have some issues with that. I think this is one of the issues, again, where politicians have spent too much time questioning what they could do as opposed to what they should do. We should make better, efficient use of the nurses we have now, because some of them are some of the most beautiful and amazing people we have. We should push them harder and further and make it more efficient before we even think of hiring more people and diluting the pool.
Okay. Anybody else any thoughts on that?
One of our policies...
No, you go first.
You go, Rob.
One of our policies is for students who wish to study medicine, along with engineering, mathematics and sciences, that they should not pay tuition fees. As I think that would be another benefit. And with regards to recruitment, previously, I said this at another hustings, previously the NHS has recruited nurses and doctors from abroad. I have absolutely no problem with that. The difficulty we face at the moment now is it's hard for us to recruit a doctor from the Commonwealth, because the EU gives free movement of persons to everyone across the EU. So great if we can get a doctor from Poland or something if we can. But one valuable source of recruitment is in fact closed off to us at present.
Okay, Ian, you can say something. Ian.
Andrew.
Yeah. Sorry, Andrew.
Well, I just reacted rather to the idea of making our doctors and nurses work harder, because they
not
are
necessarily harder, more efficiently though.
Well, I think the efficiency of the medical system is much more in the hands of the managers than it is in the frontline practitioners, because as in all areas of where the state runs things, the government gets too involved, micromanages, has loads of targets, loads of admin. Nurses spend a huge amount of time just sitting in a computer entering data and stuff. So I think we could actually free up the practitioners. The same is true in education with teachers. Free them up to do the job, then you'll get much more bang for your buck.
Yeah.
I was on the board of the Walton Hospital in Liverpool for 3 years, which is a very leading neurological hospital in the country. And what struck me at the time was the huge amount of bureaucracy and the quite a lot of very senior managers paid quite a lot of money. And it was the obvious thing was to sort of merge and to share, and that was resisted by the management. And I felt very uncomfortable about that. I think the other issue is teaching or training doctors through the system is a very, very expensive process. And once we have them, they tend to drift off to the city or they to go off and do different kinds of things. And so we're actually not getting proper value for money. So it's just an issue that's come to the fore, I think, increasingly. But I think those are a couple of things I would
Jim?
One of the things that concerns me is the use of agencies. I think that needs to be looked at, because for short term, the way that, as I understand it, the contracts are awarded. I know lots of nurses who would love to have a full-time job at a hospital, but they're only getting employed through agencies who are then creaming money off the top. So I think that should be looked at. And I would also say this is probably about the only thing that I'm likely to agree with Rob. But I do think the idea of having doctors and allowing them not to have their fees not paid if they sign up to do X amount of years is something that should be looked at. I mean, from what I understand, we need, you probably know more than me, Andrew, is that we need something like 20 or 30% of current medical graduates to become GPs, and it's nowhere near that now. That's a standstill, and we're not even achieving that now. So I think we need to look at how do we make the job more attractive. And I don't just mean throwing more money at it. I just think we need to look at the kind of respect that people. I mean, when I was a child, your doctor, your local bank manager, your local head teacher, they all earned similar sort of money, and it was more about the respect that you got in the community. There seems to be a disconnect now. If you have a local bank manager, you're quite lucky. That part of the equation, they're up here somewhere now, and the head teacher and the doctor are down here. Right. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at. Okay, many thanks. We'll move on to a new. It's come in from quite a few people, and it's about what is a very important local issue. A few of the candidates have already touched on it, and that's on planning. Many villages in the constituency are facing developers gaining land for housing despite the planning system. How will you help local communities be sure that the right kind of houses are built in the right places at the right price?
Can we kick off with... let's kick off with Andrew.
Okay. Well, I think there does need to be some element of oversight here because both the major parties feel that there is a bit of a market free-for-all. The market will decide where houses should go. And I love living in the countryside, and I can understand other people wanting to live in the countryside and live out in villages as well. So there's huge demand. But the issue about putting houses in the countryside is that those people generally have to commute quite long distances to work. There's virtually no public transport in most places, and that's something we could do something about, of course. So our roads get clogged up, and it's all sustainable, carbon emissions, terrible disaster. And the character of our villages does change. So something has to be done about that. So I would say it's something about better planning with much more consultation with people at the strategic level. And then at the local level, I am actually quite a fan of the neighbourhood system, which the Conservatives introduced in the Localism Act. But there are problems with it. It is rather slow. It's quite cumbersome. It has to fit in with the council's plan, which gives it rather limited scope for manoeuvre. And also, I think it's good for villages like Audlem, who've got a lot of articulate, clever people to take it through. But there are parts of the country where the communities just don't have the number of the people that can actually push that through. So I think the Localism Act could be amended to make neighbourhood plans much more amenable and powerful to local people.
Thank you very much indeed. Rob?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, the issue of planning, and indeed it's quite an emotive one when you speak to some of the villages, because, just give you one example, the village that I was living in until very, very recently, Davenham, that's now had a huge amount of extra planning put on it, a huge amount of development's been built there. And a lot of people in the village weren't happy, a lot of the people complained, and it seems like they got overruled. And we again, there may well be a slightly similar thing happening in Audlem, from what I can gather having a look, the decision to build on Little Heath. Now, we have to be realistic about this. There's two issues. There's firstly the fact that we need to actually build more homes. I've already discussed that. There's no doubt about that. Where then do we build those homes appears to be the issue, and how is that decision made? How the decision is made appears to be there's a planning policy framework that was put in place by this current government. Now, there's a lot of issues in planning that appear to be quite good. If you look at the previous legislation, for instance, a Section 106 payment can be made when there's local objections to a planning development. A Section 106 under the Town and Country Act 1990, I think it is, in which the developer agrees to provide certain amounts of infrastructure for that local community, effectively as a sweetener, to sort of buy the people, say, okay, well, we're going to build on your land, but we'll give you a school or something, or something like that. Now, that's not happened with Little Heath, as a lot of you know. You're due some kind of Section 106 development, but it's not happened yet. And that's unfortunately because subsequent laws have said that if Section 106 is not addressed within 5 years, then it can be overruled. That's a bit of a tragedy there. The other issue, what I would like to see is, and our policy is for a build upon brownfield sites. There are quite a large number of brownfield sites in the country, and 10 years ago, in fact, we were doing quite well in building on them, but we've turned our back on that now, and it's because, quite simply, with the current planning framework and legislation, developers find it easier to build on Greenbelt instead, and that's a tragedy.
More profitable.
Yes, it is, yeah, currently, yes.
Many thanks indeed. James?
Well, as I outlined in my opening statement, planning is a big issue and something that I want to look at. I said I want to change the whole way that planning is done. As I outlined, currently, it's the community that grants planning permission to a landowner through the council, but not always does the local community get any benefit from it. As Andrew said, I came along to your meeting on Wednesday to have a look at your neighbourhood plan, and Audlem is very fortunate. You seem to be like a very cohesive community. You have very articulate, bright people who organise things like this, and there are plenty of other communities, though, that don't have the same people, that don't have the same capacity to do it. And I agree, I think the neighbourhood plan as an idea is a good one. And I think that you need to look, though, at the way that who gets the benefit when the land is sold. The community don't necessarily get a financial benefit. And as Rob said in relation to the 106s, I mean, it's horse trading. You're trading land in return for infrastructure, or they'll promise to build you some social housing. And I just want to remove that completely. Bring the way that the land has planning permission to the council. And that way, you stop speculative developers. I mean, as I understand it now, developers can go around and actually apply for planning permission on land they don't even own, which is ridiculous. So it would just stop that dead. It would stop land banking, and it would mean that communities were able to develop in a much more cohesive and, in a way that the community gets to benefit. Homes are built, everybody's happier, I think.
Many thanks indeed. George?
Well, I agree that planning should be controlled by the local council because they know you best because they're closer to you. Eddisbury is a massive place, 1 MP, and Parliament can't control where planning permission goes here, so the local council should have control over it. However, I think there should be some limitations. For example, in countryside like this, as I think Andrew said, they are very popular places to live, and in a lot of places in Cheshire, the houses in the countryside are extremely expensive. I would say that the people who actually live in those areas should get first priority. After all, they live there, they're having children who will need housing, often in the local community. They already have a stake in that local community. So I think people from outside the area buying, although it can bring money, it puts people like you on the back shelf, which I think is wrong. So I think there should be some government regulation to that. Now, I don't think that, I can't remember which section of the Act it was, but after 5 years, that they can build social housing or a school for you to sweeten the deal, but after 5 years it's overruled. I don't think that should happen at all. I think it should never be overruled. You make a deal, you stick with a deal. That's not rocket science, that's basic business ethics, and that's just basic professionalism. So I would say that not only should they have to do that, but I actually think by not doing that, it amounts to fraud. I think there should be sanctions when the people of the community sign a contract with a developer and have sanctions against a developer if they don't keep to their side of the bargain, as that is only fair.
Thanks. Ian?
Well, we need 300,000-400,000 houses every year in this country. Sadly, I think the neighbourhood plan, though absolutely great idea in principle, it's already being busted. I think we're seeing targets set in it that are already being exceeded by the number of applications. So unless there is kind of quite a lot of power around those documents and they're only there as guidance, then I think there is problems ahead, unfortunately. I noticed a lot of the developers, the profits of Red Row, for example, 92% up last year. So I think there's a huge incentive for developers to get in there now whilst there's this gap until we get our planning sorted. I think the other issue structurally is that for a piece of land in some town here with planning permission is worth £1 million an acre if it's in the right place. Now, arable land is not worth anything like that. So that's a real incentive, if you like. So I think the community has to have some clawback on that, either through a right of appeal or something. And also there is a tendency, because of the targets being set by government, to involve political judgments overriding inspectors, and that's becoming kind of reasonably commonplace. I'm with everyone on the brownfield, though it's quite more tricky, but it has huge benefits in terms of infill and making towns attractive. But I do notice also that of the 1,000 properties or so, we know exactly, like it's 3,500, I think, around about 1%, just over that, are actually done as affordable. And of course, we all know what affordable has no legal kind of characteristic, particularly 300,000, and I think that's not affordable. And you don't end up owning it anyway; you have to rent half of it or whatever. So that's seen. So we have big problems, I think, going forward on planning, and I think we have to think long term, and we're not going to get it right. And also, we need to plan a lot more strategically.
Many thanks. To buy. Do you kick off?
Well, the Green Party is against it because it's reduced our stock of social housing considerably, and I just underline that. I think we do need social housing.
Okay, James.
The Labour Party's policy isn't to remove it, but I'm wholly opposed to the idea that the Conservatives have put forward in relation to housing associations. I find it staggering, actually, that the Conservative Party would even put forward legislation which would tell a private company to sell its assets for less than the market value. So I don't definitely agree with extending it.
Rob?
We agree with it, but we'd like to see the money that's made from it put back into the actual social housing itself, which is one of the problems in the 1980s when the right to buy council homes was introduced. The money that it created could have been given and pumped back into developing housing, and it wasn't.
The problem with Rob is that if you do that, you're then just building properties which are then compelled to sell for less than they cost. And that is the problem with building more with more social housing. I wish the Labour Party weren't in favour of it. Weren't in favour of keeping it, but they are.
George?
Good for you. I say for things like right to buy, there's a time and a place. It's not the time or the place. We have a shortage of social housing. The last thing we need is more private corporations diluting the pool.
Yeah?
I don't think I can improve on that.
Right. We're getting some lovely agreements here, aren't we? Right. Let's move on to another question. And this question was raised by Jeff Seddon at a social event last week. Is on Europe. What are your views on the European Union? And if there is an in-out referendum, which way will you vote? Rob, I think we have to start with you on this.
Thank you, you're very kind. I have given this a small amount of thought. What's interesting about this, and what I'll be honest, I didn't fully realise until I started campaigning properly for this election and started speaking to people, is how much, and I mentioned it in my introduction, how much the actual European Union has a direct effect on people here in Eddisbury with bread and butter issues. Yes, a lot of people think, okay, well, they've not audited their accounts, blah, blah, blah. Yes, they're not properly, the European Commission's not properly elected, it's government by appointment, etc. But that's not a doorstep issue. It does become a doorstep issue when you mention the cost of HS2, which is actually being introduced because it's in line with European Commission directives. £70 billion, according to one estimate. It may, in fact, be more. And then when people in some areas speak to you about the issue of immigration and the pressure put on local services and the pressure put on wage deflation due to mass movements of people from Eastern Europe, as opposed to getting the right people in the right numbers, which is what we did previously for a long time. There should be a referendum. It's a fundamental issue as to how you are governed, and do you want to be governed by the people you elect or by the people that are actually appointed in Brussels. Yes, I'm in favour of us leaving the European Union. I believe it hasn't contributed towards security. I believe it's contributed towards insecurity instead. And how people can say it somehow kept the peace in Europe, I don't know. What was NATO doing for 45 years then in that case? That's all I've got to say for now.
Do I need to ask how you would vote?
No, you don't. No.
Right, Ian.
I mean, first of all, there's kind of geopolitical issues. Europe is a excuse me. We are part of Europe. Europe is a massive trading bloc. We also have to work around the world, where we have increasingly the attention focusing from the US into the Pacific area, from Australasia up into China. China now controls pretty well all the investment going into Africa. So you have these kind of tectonic plates moving around in trade terms. And we have here on our doorstep, and it's not going away, a really quite important, very developed set of trading partners with whom we have a huge amount in common in terms of being able to move people around, buy services, and sell our goods. And so many jobs are dependent on it. And it is something that one has to really, really think hard before you'd want to leave it. And the issue I have at the moment with it is like kind of almost like a divorce. I mean, don't you talk before you get divorced, or do we always want to be seen as neither in nor out? And I think if we're not engaged and involved with Europe, and Europe will change over the next 10, 20 years, then we are simply keeping ourselves away from the ability to influence that. And I think that's a significant failure, a threat to this country. I think it's a shame that the Conservative candidate isn't here, because they are balancing on a razor blade on this issue. The Conservatives have for 30, 40 years been pretty well split on it. And I think whatever happens at the election, and we can talk about that later, I guess, but it's certainly going to be a significant issue. We could end up it's an existential threat to this country by encouraging a Conservative alliance possibly with UKIP on this issue. And whatever they say, politicians now, you don't really want to kind of totally believe them until we start to see the whites of the eyes after the election. So anything can happen around that. I think also, as a person who spent a lot of time in business, the chilling effect of having a referendum over the next 2 or 3 years will really inhibit people from making those very, very important decisions which are going to influence jobs and investment going forward.
Thanks very much indeed. George?
Okay, I want to give a demonstration. This is a battery. This is a cartridge. This is an electronic cigarette.
Not allowed smoking here.
Smoking's different. Because of EU regulation, this battery will not explode in my face and injure me. A lot of EU regulation has made many of our products safer. I don't agree with all of them. I do think they do take too much power. But there are many advantages to the European Union. I can leave any time I want, go on holiday any time I want, work in Europe any time I want, live in Europe any time I want. And I intend to. One day, I would love to retire abroad, preferably in Spain. Now, I know that there are some disadvantages to Europe, such as trying to infringe on our laws. Britain is a strong political leader in the world. We should be trying to reform Europe to make, as Labour said in their 2010 manifesto, a future fair for all. Sorry to bring that up. But I believe that to step out of it, we will isolate ourselves. We shouldn't be isolated. The world isn't separated into states anymore. That is a relic of the Cold War. That died a horrible death. We are living in a world where everyone is interconnected, and thanks to the internet, we're even more interconnected. Thanks to trade and the fact that tariffs have been lifted, the cost of freight is down, we're even more interconnected. We cannot afford to isolate ourselves. Now, if they did try to infringe more on our laws, I would have more of a problem with the European Union. But for the moment, I am very much pro-European. And I'd like to point out that the companies Nissan and Toyota have also said the only reason that they're doing business in the UK is because they want a foothold in Europe. Have also said that.
James?
Well, I'd agree with what George and Ian have said mainly. I think that industry has let it be known that they would be very worried about us leaving Europe. I personally think that Europe is a good, and I think that Britain is a strong voice in Europe. That's not to say that things don't need to be changed. I think that there are bits of the European structure that we need to change. In terms of having a referendum, the Labour Party policy is if there is significant treaty change, we'll have a referendum. If we have a referendum today, I would vote to stay in. I disagree with Rob. This is the third hustings we've done, and we disagree about the security. I think that the European Union, in all its guises, starting off with the iron and coal, all the way through the EEC, the EU, NATO runs parallel with that. I think that if we were to leave Europe, I think that Europe would disintegrate. I think that the rest of Europe would come tumbling down, and I think NATO would not be far behind it. I personally am quite worried by Russia, so I think that to weaken Europe now would be a mistake, because I think that it would also weaken NATO. I think that the benefits that we get, as George has already outlined, we could travel around Europe, nothing stopping us going anywhere in Europe. I think the British sometimes have a sort of a more myopic view, because a lot of British people don't only speak English and they feel that they can't go into Europe. In my job, I work all over the world, and I work a lot around Europe, and I know that the Europeans that I work with, they speak many languages, so I think that they feel it to be much more open. I think it's the fact that sometimes, because the English speak English, they feel they can't go to some of these countries and they can't work. But it's not the case. I know plenty of people that work all around Europe, and they would be forced to come back. Many of our people who've retired, as George wants to do, to Spain, they would have to come back. There are I think there's 1 million British people that live out in Europe. It's not just a one-way trip.
Many thanks. Andrew?
Thank you. Well, I would vote to stay in, and I would echo many of the points that have already been made. I'd underline, really, really important, this was the start of the European Union was created by France and Germany, bitterly torn apart by the war, Second World War. And it was a deliberate attempt to create a common interest. This is what we have in the European Union. We have a stake in other people's countries, and they have a stake with us. So because we have a common interest, that keeps the peace. I think also the green ethic is really about localism. So for many green people, the EU is a big, massive body, and we would prefer to think locally. But we are where we are. We have a lot of global problems that require global solutions. And, really you could argue that we need to have a global government, but I mean, if we have that, then UKIP people will have an apoplectic fit. So let's Europe and saying that actually, the European Union reflects our values generally, and it is a powerful voice in the world, and I think we would be the poorer for it, and we would make no contribution, and I think that would be sad, because I think we've got a big contribution to make to the world. So there is a lot of regulations and directives, but as George says, that's about keeping us safe, and it's about ensuring a level playing field, making sure the consumers aren't exploited. I'd highlight a lot of the environmental legislation that's been good for us, such as removal of lead in petrol, making our bathing beaches safer. And I would also say, yes, the free movement of people across boundaries is something I very much treasure.
Thank you. Just one question. I think the Greens are in favour of a referendum, though, aren't they?
Well, I hope not. Well, I've no problem about having a referendum, but that's the way I would vote.
Right.
Yeah, to stay.
We're going to move on to a slightly, it sounds like a softer question, but I think it might be quite a tough one. On AudlemOnline each day, we publish a thought of the day, often quotes from famous people. If you had a thought of the day, maybe up to sort of 25, 30 words, maybe somebody who's inspired you in the past, something which we could even publish over the next few days, what would you come up with? Ian, I'll put you on the spot first.
It's totally unfair.
Who said that?
And by the way, we don't want things like vote UKIP or vote Green.
Fair enough.
It's really about what we value in our own community, and what we can draw from that, and how we keep connected to that as we seek to do things on a national scale. So how you can keep the thread, the links, the energy going between what is happening at a national level in this country and what is clearly happening here at a local level, as we're going through a particularly choppy period, I think, in politics, and we will emerge the other side, I think, with issues like proportional representation, all kinds of different ways of people that their views have not really been taken into account when it comes down to the government, because no government's going to win an outright majority.
Right. George?
That is a very
I'm going to go around in this order, so you're pre-warned.
That is a very difficult one. I like a lot of people. I think probably the one for me would be, we live in a culture of victimisation where it's easier to be a victim than to stand up for yourself, by Marilyn Manson.
I like that one. Rob?
Be true to yourself. Confidence and strength are the best virtues you can have.
I like it.
He said it.
And that's it.
He said it.
Me.
James?
I suppose mine would be treat others as you want to be treated as yourself. Give unto your ability and take unto from your need.
Andrew?
I haven't got the exact quote, but some words of Albert Schweitzer come to mind, which were along the lines of, if you respect and love the environment, you will respect and love all human beings, and vice versa. The two are intimately interconnected.
That's probably more tested than most of the other questions, actually. Right, we're going to move on to a question about farming, and the dairy industry is very, very large around here. And this question is a combined one, really, from Anne Tilling and John Gray. And it is, how will you influence the competing interests of farmers, supermarkets and consumers? Could the candidates say how they would support our local dairy farmers who are being squeezed by the low prices paid for milk by the supermarkets and indeed by the milk processors as well? Do you want to keep in the chair? Andrew?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very tough one because, we have I was at Rees Heath actually, doing hustings with some of you folks just a few days ago, and this one came up. And I learnt quite a lot actually, as you might imagine. But it occurred to me really that there isn't a huge amount that you can do unless you go in there with some heavy legislation within the existing system. It was pointed out that milk is a world commodity, so prices will go up and down, so supply and demand, etc. I mean, maybe you can do something to stop the supermarkets being so cutthroat. Maybe you could have some minimum pricing or something like that. But I was struck really by the need to move to a totally different model, because at the moment our agricultural model means that huge profits are being made by the supermarkets and also by big agri-businesses, selling fertiliser and pesticides, etc. The Greens, it won't surprise you to know, are much more keen on small-scale, sustainable agriculture, so local supply of food, organic preferably, fresh, tasty, and it seems to me that there isn't very much mileage left in the current agricultural model, and we need to switch to something radically different. I mean, soil quality is deteriorating slowly but inexorably. We can't go on like that forever. And the amount of carbon emissions accounted for by agriculture is 7%. Just huge. So it's unsustainable. We have to change to a different model. So I suppose my answer is I wouldn't start from here.
Okay. James?
Well, I mean, I find it bonkers that a pint of milk will be sold for less in a supermarket than a bottle of water. I don't see how that's a sustainable business model for anybody. I'm quite pleased that the sort of supermarket czar that's been set up is looking at introducing milk. I think that food is different to normal business. I think that accommodations should be made to make sure that farmers can provide food and that they can get a return on it. I think supermarkets need to be challenged on what they're doing. Again, I'm disappointed that my party doesn't want to do more. This is I'm talking about James Lang's opinion now, not the Labour Party's opinion. I mean, I met with some farmers, and the most depressing thing about discussing about the price of milk was that they didn't have any solutions. They had no idea how they were going to fix this. So I'm open to suggestions. I mean, I said, having met with farmers, they weren't able to tell me that this is what needs to be done or that is what needs to be done. In the same as I related it to the NHS, I would be happy to listen to farmers as to what they thought would be the solutions, and I would try and make their voices heard. I'm not going to pretend that I've got the answers to what is obviously a very difficult time. I mean, my opening comment was that water is more expensive than milk. So, I mean, to me, that's just crazy. And the question that I would always thought I was going to get asked, because they always try and have this idea they're going to catch politicians out and ask them how much is a pint of milk. So I went and checked, because I don't buy pints of milk. I imagine most of you don't buy pints of milk. I buy 4 litres or 6 litres for my family. And I was actually amazed, because you never give it any thought generally, you just put it in the thing. But in my supermarket, you can get 4 pints of milk for £1, which I think is just, well, I wouldn't mind paying, personally, I wouldn't mind paying an extra 10p if that was what was needed to protect the dairy industry, so that I didn't have to rely on milk to come from God knows where. I would rather have it come from local farms.
James, we're a very kind community down here in Oldham, so we didn't actually come up with any questions just to catch you out. So, Rob?
This is a very difficult question, and the issues are very complicated. The issues are strategic, but they're also, in many cases, it comes right down to the local level. And I think when Andrew was talking about sort of smaller, sustainable organic farms, that's a very attractive idea. But the problem with that is that, much as I actually sympathise with that point of view, the problem with that is that will then come up against some of the problems that come through with the Competition Commission, as it's called, which is looking at trying to set and standardise milk prices. That remit is due to expire this month, so I hope that a good, strong look can be taken at that. But it's going to be very difficult because there's actually significant disparities between the size of farms. I mean, if you've got a herd of 100 cows, you're going to be really struggling. And that was the sort of size of the farm of the dairy farm that I met with last month, and I also met with a representative of the NFU at the same place. So it's really it's not an easy question, and I'll be honest, I'll put my hand up and say I'm no expert, but I think if we at least look at the Competition Commission and the work thereof, and currently it seems that the very large farms do in fact rather well out of this, but the smaller farms are really suffering, so something has to be done to look at this. And perhaps inevitably, if we look at the Competition Commission, the price of milk will go up in the supermarkets. I think that's going to be the knock-on effect. Let's be realistic about that. The price of milk will probably go up, but then dairy farmers then might be able to not live in relative poverty. That's probably the situation we're in, folks, I suspect.
Many thanks. George?
Well, I just want to first of all just clarify how bad the situation is for dairy farmers. Most of them break even, some of them make a loss. There have been a number of cases where dairy farmers have committed suicide, and as someone who's attempted suicide on 6 occasions myself, I find that vile and deplorable. Unfortunately, this is what happens when you have an unregulated, laissez-faire culture of doing business, especially in something as delicate as food that is very tending to fluctuate. Unfortunately, we are going to have to ask very tough questions. We are going to have to hold the corporations to account, but unfortunately, A, it's not going to be easy, and B, any reform we try to put forward, we're going to have to grab the companies by the hair and drag them in kicking and screaming, which, again, is not going to be easy, and all the while, we have innocent people in the thick of it. Unfortunately, I cannot answer the question as well as I'd like to. I'm not good on dairy, I don't even like milk. But the truth is, this is going to be a difficult one. We have to ask really tough questions, and most of all, we have to hold Tesco's, Sainsbury's, Waitrose, and every other company that deals with milk into account, and we have to really attack them for it.
I'll just have a sip of my milk-based drink, actually. Ian, to answer that.
I've got problems with the way it's sold.
Well, we have one of our. Well, first of all, I was brought. My uncle had a dairy farm in Dunham Massey, and I used to go as a boy and drink the delicious milk that he used to produce early one morning and break the ice. And one of our candidates standing in the council elections is a very successful dairy farmer. He gets 32p from Tesco's. So maybe I should introduce you if you have an issue, because that seems like quite a good price. I think the party that my party position on it is that clearly regulation is something that has to come in when there is a crisis, and to work out if there is anything that can be done. And we're suggesting a grocery code adjudicator, a kind of role between supermarkets and farmers' representatives. And one can be cynical, but it's a step that might help, and it would give farmers some certainty, at least, about how to approach the market. I think the other issue is, apart from kind of a national food strategy, which is, I think, what kind of Andrew maybe, or they're sort of working our way towards eventually, is the badgers issue. Actually, I think that's really hit dairy farming quite badly, and I noticed with interest that the local Bolesworth estate and others have got together and now using government money or private money to look at badger vaccination, which is something we would support very much. And I think it's a science-based approach. But once we need to get our hands on that. I mean, just on the point on the NFU, I think we all probably went through a hallowed tradition of going to see the person. But clearly, there's a lot of scope with non-farm income as well. And I think that particular person was looking into that quite actively, and that's another option, obviously, for some farmers.
Can I just, on this one, finish it by just stressing how important this is locally? I mean, we're actually seeing large dairy herds sold off, herds that have been milked for years being sold off, and it's a tragedy locally. And yes, there are some supermarkets that are playing the game correctly. There's a bunch of them.
You can't expect people to be in business and produce a product and then sell it for less than it costs to make it.
Well, they have to borrow six-figure sums just to keep going for a year. It's crazy. But
yes.
Anyway, we'll move on to another question. This question has been raised by Roger Cole, and it's about Scotland. I must admit, we were half tempted to ask our cameraman at the back, who hails from Aberdeen, to step into the empty chair to represent the SNP on this one. But The question is, how do you propose to prevent the UK splintering into 4 nationalist sections within the life of the next Parliament? I mean, this might be a big issue on May the 8th. James, can we start with you?
Yeah, I campaigned hard last year to keep Scotland in part of the United Kingdom, and 55% of Scots agreed with me, and that's the way that they voted. There's been a lot in the press recently, and with regard to the SNP and our party, I don't know how to make this more clear, really. In the Labour Party generally, we dislike the SNP almost as much as we dislike the Tories. You were disappointed the other day when I said it wasn't you, weren't you? I don't like nationalism. I think it's dangerous, and I will campaign, and I'm sure everybody in the Labour Party will campaign against it. I quickly want to say in relation to the SNP, because it's been mentioned. I think if you watched the debate last night, in relation to my party, Ed Miliband made it perfectly clear that we will not be in any way, shape or form do a deal or have a coalition with the SNP, and that the Labour Party, we're interested in implementing our manifesto. We're not interested in ministerial jags and being in office. We just want to make sure that we get our manifesto through, and if we can't do it because the other parties won't vote for it, we won't do deals with them. We would rather that the Labour government fell. Me personally, if I was elected as your MP, and I will assure you there will be no SNP ministers in a Labour government, if there were, I would resign, I would force a by-election.
Many thanks indeed.
Thank you. I would pick up on James' point. I don't think the SNP is actually particularly nationalist. It's not saying that Scotland is great, that, you know, but what it's saying is that it doesn't like the way we're governed in this country at the moment. That those that voted for the SNP and are sympathetic do not like the Westminster-based establishment, the elite that rules for its own benefit, and they want a different sort of politics, which is much more similar to the Scandinavian countries. And as a Green Party member, I'm very, very sympathetic to that. And I would like to live in that sort of country. So I have a lot of sympathy with the Scots wanting to be independent. I'm not saying that I would facilitate it because I'm not.
Did you campaign against it?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I watched with interest as Scotland formed its views. But I had a lot of sympathy, as I say. So I would like to see, and it's interesting that Nicola Sturgeon is making noises about how she might reform things in Britain or help nurture those forces in the rest of Britain that actually want more devolution and to take power away from the Westminster establishment. So I've forgotten what the question was now. How would I prevent it?
How do you prevent it splintering into 4 nations?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would prevent it if that's what those 4 nations wanted,
right.
But I don't think that's the best option. We need fundamental constitutional reform in Britain so that there is more devolution and power is taken away from the Westminster elite.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think I kind of, just on the SNP, it's an unknown factor really as they have developed over 60 to 70 years. If they are in this situation after May the 7th, then it's the nature of things that they will begin to have an internal discussion about what kind of party in government or the role that they're playing in government is going to matter to them as they develop their own particular. So it's not kind of over yet. There's no monolithic block, if you like, of SNPs. I think it would need to be perhaps a bit more subtle. I think the other issue around SNP and Labour is that, you know, this is what happens, I think, in safe seats. If you have a safe seat where a Labour MP has been there for 80 years or so, I think it begins to atrophy. I think that over time things begin not to be challenged and things begin to start to slip down the slope, and it's very, very easy to become almost rotten from the inside, and then this tsunami happens. So I think it's part of everyone's kind of schadenfreude about this is that, well, you know, did you not do your job better, and shouldn't you have done it better? So I think there's some split emotion on that. The other point, I think, is that Scotland would argue that if we did leave the EU, that they would probably, at that point, argue to split because they would get more money from the EU, possibly through structural funds, than they would by staying in the UK through the Barnett formula. So this discussion is going to go on a long way. In terms of how to prevent it, well, you obviously have to vote Liberal Democrat because we are now the only party that sees this as an existential threat, and that we are represented in all parts of the UK apart from Northern Ireland, and we want it clearly to stay together. So that's your best option if you don't want to see the UK splitting up.
Thanks, Ian. Rob?
Yeah, out of interest, at the European election, 25% of the Scots voted for UKIP. So, it's not as, as pure of a subject as Nicola Sturgeon would like to present. I think the Scottish nationalists are basically, they've got a complete straw man argument on a number of issues. And I think Nicola Sturgeon has had a very, very easy ride in the media throughout this campaign. She's never been asked any tough questions. And when she has, she has simply refused to answer them. I'll give you one example. The Labour Party pointed out the fact that, where, if there was an independent Scotland, where was it going to get the taxes from to pay for the services they had? And in addition to that, what services were they going to cut to make up their budget? And she didn't answer the question at all. She simply ranted and raved, the only cuts that will be in Scotland will be Tory cuts, blah, blah, blah. I think that was very poor electioneering on her behalf, but it's just typical of the kind of petulance that seems to be around the SNP an awful lot of the time. There's an issue here also with regards to our electoral system. First person past the post in Scotland is what's making the SNP so powerful. If it was a proportional representation type system, I think you would not see this situation. You would see, you'd see a Scotland with the SNP being there, but basically probably more veering towards the centre left. But I don't think it will be particularly radical, the politics from there. Finally, the issue of austerity. The SNP are an austerity party. In spite of what they say, they do intend spending cuts. They just want to spread them out a little bit longer than what the Labour Party are doing, and they're riding on a lot of cheap rhetoric at the moment. That will stand for itself. Once they, after this election, the SNP will not be able to make the case that they're doing because, they just won't be able to because they're basically pro-austerity. But I'd look at the Barnett formula and I would reduce some of the money we send to Scotland. Give them a bit of tough love. I'm half Scottish myself. I actually like the place. It's a nice place to go on holiday. But their politics is a mess.
You think that would help keep the union together?
Yes. I do think it would help keep the union together. Okay. If you just throw money at it, a spoiled child, you just keep throwing money at it, it gets more spoiled and petulant. Tell them to raise their own taxes if they want free prescription fees or whatever they want.
George?
Well, I'd like to point out, Andrew, you made a startling error in your statement.
Just the one.
Yeah, just the one. You confused nationalism with patriotism. The Scottish National Party are nationalists because they want an independent Scottish nation all to themselves. I'm completely against that. I think if they leave, they'll be begging to come back.
I think you understood my drift, though.
I have problems with the language, it has to be. So as I said, I think they would beg to come back. The Scottish economy is in a lot of ways based on oil. I don't really need to say much about that unless you've been living under a rock for the past 3 months. Oil prices, boom! They would not survive without us. I think Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond both are making a mistake for even thinking about Scottish independence. I think another problem is I think the people of Scotland, and I'm sorry to say this, they really need a kick in the teeth. They talk about, let's get the Tories out of power, but they seem to think that you can somehow vote for Labour by proxy, and that won't work. A vote for the SNP would let the Tories in. I'm sorry, that is just the way it is, and they have to realise that. And that's say on the subject. There's not much I can do, and to be honest with you, it's such a hard subject that it's dangerous water.
I'll just mention that I think it was, 6 years ago, in what admittedly was a spoof poll, but we did run it, the people of Audlem voted to apply to become part of Wales. Which news that went all around the world, and we did it for the free hospital parking and for the free prescriptions.
Could you do that if you wanted to?
I don't think so, but it did attract a lot of media attention, I have to say. Right, we're going to move on to one on the environment, and this question's been put forward by Chris Thornton. and it is what will the candidate's position be on global warming and climate change if elected, and in particular, and maybe a fair bit of emphasis on this second half of the question, and in particular, how should the country keep the lights on? Andrew, I think you should kick us off with this one.
Yeah. Well, the current current carbon emission reduction targets are not nearly enough. We have by 2030, as opposed to 80% reduction by 2050, and that fits in with the science of keeping an inhabitable planet. So, you know, that underpins everything when you think about it. We've got to, if we want to save our planet, we've got to gear our entire economy, our entire energy policy within that perspective. So how do you do that? Well, the big one is actually insulation. If we're talking about the UK, houses and businesses, it is absolutely crazy that our houses are so poorly insulated. The Green Deal, which the coalition government instituted to help insulation, to enable insulation in properties, has been a complete failure. We've moved forward hardly an inch in the last 5 years. So we must find ways of pumping money, considerable amounts of money, into insulating our houses and businesses. And of course, a huge number of jobs will result from that. So it's a win-win situation. So we need to reduce the demand and replace the supply with, we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to invest much more in renewables. And renewables have the issue, of course, that you can only go so far when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. So we need to invest much more in energy storage mechanisms. And there's quite a lot of research going on into that, but we need to do much more of it.
Nuclear?
Okay. The Green Party is against nuclear for all sorts of reasons. That it is dangerous, it's expensive, and is not as carbon neutral.
James?
I think I would respect that analysis.
Okay. James?
I'm in a difficult position because, personally, I have a horrendous carbon footprint. I fly around the world filming racing cars. But the one thing that's been interesting about that is that I get to see what goes on in lots of other countries. I think that the real problem that I have is that I would like to see emissions coming down, and I think that everybody can do a little bit. But one of the things that really troubled me was I was in Dubai a while back. And there they have one of these ski slopes indoor, in the middle of the desert, like you do. And then I was in the desert, inside a fake ski slope, and standing on like the après-ski with a patio heater heating me back up again. And I just thought, well, this is what's going on in the world.
It's obscene.
It is obscene, and I agree. And I go to China and I see what's going on there, and the amount of coal-powered fire stations are opening, the amount of building that's going on. And
they're making products rust, though.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I think that the problem is that I personally I'm against fracking. I think that's problematic, and I won't vote for it. My party have agreed a moratorium on it. Now, I personally, even if they unchange the moratorium, I won't vote for fracking. I think it's wrong. I would rather see, like the Green Party, I think that we've already found more than enough fossil fuels currently to poison ourselves without taking more of them out. But it's one of those, do as I say, not as I do. That's my problem. One of my best friends is an Italian who's he's a member of the Italian Green Party, and he flies around the world even more than I do, filming even more racing cars than I do. So I find there seems to be a lot of talking around this, and you said that in relation to it keeping the lights on, and that's the problem when it comes to it at the end of the day. I think people want the change, but they're not prepared to go without.
Right. Thanks for that. Rob?
Yeah, this is actually a very good question. With the issue of global warming, I'm agnostic. I suspect the climate is changing. Is mankind responsible? No, I'm not convinced of the case for mankind being responsible. But even so, certain things are, how you have to find them. But it's correct, but there's a lot of things with technology, and there's a lot of things developing right now that show how the free market can help the environment because people are concerned about it. There's new initiatives, new technologies with regards to solar power being brought on board. That's a good idea for housing. It has a role in industry to some extent as well. The latest technologies for solar are very interesting at all. Another thing, just about last week, Audi reported that they developed a carbon-neutral form of diesel fuel developed from renewable sources. So, that's a free market, that's, advancing, and that's a technology being advanced by people who, if you put your good brains into it and you want to make money, and you know what it is you're looking for, you can do that far better than any kind of statist approach. Because interestingly enough, the Soviet Union was a pretty damn key polluter when they were at their height. To keep the lights on, we need a balanced approach for energy. It's like an orchestra. You've got to have all the different constituent parts. We do need nuclear. We need more of it. And there is a role for recyclables, and there's a role, or renewables is probably what I was looking for. And there's a role for what we can do. And particularly, I'm interested myself in solar power at the moment. A friend of mine, he's got a consultancy that works in that, and some of the information he's given me is quite interesting. Wind farms, I don't think they're a good idea. No, I'd rather have a nuclear power station next door to me than a wind farm. That's my opinion.
Thanks very much, George.
Well, first of all, in response to what you said about how soil is deteriorating, part of my drug reform policy is also to have less restrictions on industrial hemp, which binds the soil up, so it makes it essentially reverses soil deterioration. It can be used to make clothes, and also it makes hemp seed, which could be an acre of hemp could produce 300 litres of gasoline. I personally do agree with nuclear. I think we need more of it. I think even though there are some risks, we've learnt lessons. I know they all talk about atomic bombs, nuclear meltdowns, but the fourth generation of nuclear reactors are one of the safest ones that we have, and they can be built by gutting old, unused coal power stations. And we also need more research into nuclear fusion, which is the science of recreating the sun on Earth. As Rob kindly pointed out, we need a balanced approach. Again, we need to ask some tough questions. We've gotten used to this system that we have now. We need to toughen our stance, grow a pair, basically, and we have to ask some hard questions about what we're going to do, how we're going to do it. And again, insulation, I'm shocked at hearing that. Britain is stereotypically freezing cold. Why don't we have more insulation? I know it's not always freezing cold, but often it is quite cold, and we need more insulation. I think that should just come, as it goes back to the housing planning, that should come standard with every single house. It makes it more energy efficient, it makes it more valuable. Thank you.
Many thanks. Ian?
There's going to be 1 billion more people in Africa by 2050. Countries like Yemen are effectively run out of water. Size of Wales almost every year disappears in our jungles, on our precious rainforest jungles. There's a huge, huge global threat, and I don't think it's got much. We're not going to be able to deal with it unless we deal with it at an international level. And I would argue for a strong, obviously, cooperation on this, because we only have one planet. But whatever the science, the science is pretty clear. For whatever reason, the globe is heating up. We have to do, and we have to look at all kinds of ways of trying to do our thing here in the UK. But equally, we have to rely on looking at what we mean by growth, because every country, as it develops and goes through various stages of development, has to get to a point when it becomes capable of investing in new technologies. And Britain is particularly good at that. We've now got a leading offshore wind industry in the world. We're manufacturing huge amounts of things that are helpful. We are extremely well positioned for renewables. In fact, about 20% now of our energy. The Conservatives have a view on this. I mean, they want a moratorium on a lot of renewable technologies, but they also want on moratoriums on fracking. So, we do have a problem here of addressing what kind of energy, what kind of diversity we want. So, I'm sorry, this is a huge subject, but I say that international is extremely important. We have to manage this on an international basis. We have to keep efficiencies. We have to keep with renewables. We're doing our bit, and our party is really at the front of a lot of this.
Thanks very much indeed. Now, we're running out of time now, and I want to move on to a question about the issue we haven't discussed in any detail, but which may well dominate the election, and that's the economy. This is a composite question that's come in from quite a few people, and it is that all parties have talked at length about the budget deficit. Should it be reduced? And if so, how would you do it? James, do you want to kick us off?
Well, Labour is committed to reducing the deficit over the lifetime of the Parliament. Every budget that Labour Chancellor presents will have within it a deficit reduction plan, and hopefully by the end of the Parliament there will be a surplus. Should it be paid off? I think that the answer to that is it appears to be what the country wants. To me, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's like having a mortgage, I think, and saying, right, well, you've got to pay your mortgage off now. You can't buy anything else. You've just got to concentrate on paying your mortgage down. So I'm not sure I'm not sure that it is as significant as it's presented in the media, but it seems to be what the people want, and we're here to represent the people, so that's why Labour has committed to do what it's going to do. We want to do it slightly slower than the Conservatives. We think that their policies are much more ideological driven, and they're using paying off the deficit as a way of attacking our public services and for punishing the vulnerable and the poor. I personally, again, this is James Lang, not the Labour Party, I would want to slow it down even more. I think that it's like having a mortgage. I think what needs to be paid off is the debt. The way I understand it is that the deficit and the debt is like a credit card. The deficit is how much we're spending, the debt is what we're accumulating. I think that's more of a danger, and I think we need to look at getting that down.
But unless you reduce the deficit,
well,
the debt's
yes.
going to go up.
Well, I think you can pay off your debt, and you might have to borrow. You might have to cut the deficit. It's about whether I think the deficit should be removed. I don't think the deficit should be removed quite so fast. I think as long as you are paying it down and paying off your debt, you can't carry on. You can't just carry on spending money you haven't got any more than I could, or as a country. But I think that you need to look at what the damage can be done to our public services if we pay it off too fast. I don't think there's any problem with slowing down the rate of paying, as long as you're paying it off.
Rob?
Well, this is a major problem, and this is one that the current government has not dealt with as well as they could have done, which is perhaps an understatement. The actual total amount of debt has increased by a third in the previous 5 years, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies, to quote them, they critiqued the manifestos of 4 of the political parties. They didn't do ours, but we got ours independently verified in any case. And they criticised, in particular, they said that actually none of the parties had a clear, sound case for the economy, which is quite shocking when you bear in mind that this debt will have to be paid. It will have to be paid by the next generation, and it can lead to all manner of serious problems if it is not paid. You can look at Greece, which has imploded because it failed to deal with effectively their own debt, and they funded a huge number of public programmes for which there wasn't sufficient money, and it's now collapsed into chaos, and there's far left and far right groups causing all sorts of trouble there. So we could store up problems if we do not address this issue. What I would like to do, and what our personal policy is, we have to be clear what we're going to do to spend, to not spend money rather than spend it. And an awful lot of politicians here will always turn around and promise you X, Y, Z in order to buy votes effectively. I think that is a really serious problem. I could quote a former, well, she's a former Tory by dint of the fact that she's dead, but who said that the problem with socialism is that you always run out of other people's money. And that never a truer word was spoken, and just look to Greece for a current contemporary example of that tragedy.
It wasn't socialist when it started running out the debts, though, was it?
The socialists came in after the run of the debt, and then the Syriza party.
Yeah, and then they came in arguing that they don't want to pay back the debt. Yeah.
Ian?
Well, I mean, cutting too quick is a powerful cause of recessions. I mean, if you look at the United States in the 30s, as one example, there is a pace at which you address this, because if you start to take away, not just talking about safety nets and talking about spending in the economy, then over time that drains away the ability to earn a living and create jobs and all the rest of it. So you have to do it at a pace aligned with the pace of recovery. The problem is that recovery is very fragile. So there is a huge difference between wealth in the economy. We have about 7 trillion pound economy. So there is money, but how do you make sure that that money is effectively engaged? And there's a lot of money in private housing. I mean, if you just think about that, it's not productive particularly. It's a market. So the deficit is there. I mean, it's the difference between what we receive and what we're spending. So that debt that it is contributing towards is now getting up to a point when everyone is paying about £2,000 a year towards the servicing of that debt, which is about £43 billion currently. So where I'm kind of heading on this is that, yes, we have to manage that level of debt because interest rates are really low at the moment. And if they start to go up, as wages will recover, then interest rates will climb. And then at that point, it won't be 2,000, it'll be 5,000 and so on. So yes, we have to do it, but we have to do it in a way that is managed and fair, and that is a sensible thing. And then look at the situation in 5 years' time to start to reinvest in capital assets, because you only borrow when capital assets are cheap.
Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, when this topic is discussed, I can't help but think of the phrase that's often used to describe accountants, and I hope no accountants listening will be offended, but that they know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. And I do feel that politicians that we've got at the moment are very much like that, with the exception of Natalie Bennett, who sees things very, very differently. That we actually, when we cut services, we actually know very, very little about what the knock-on effect is going to be. But there are some studies. I mean, if you look at the impact of shutting a Sure Start centre on the ongoing costs and misery of that child being brought up in a less than optimum environment, they're considerable. So Sure Start is a really, really good investment, a good use of money, and there are lots of other social welfare schemes that are like that. So I'm interested in your comparison with mortgages. I mean, yes, it's not good that we spend 7% as a country, if that's the right figure, something like that, on interest payments. Why would you do that if you didn't have to? But many of our families are spending a much higher percentage of that with their mortgage. And they're prepared to do that because they get something very important, very valuable, a house to live in, a nice house. So I think we really do need to break it down, as Natalie Bennett was suggesting, and just understand, what we're borrowing for. Let's match the borrowing requirement for a particular investment and see if it's worthwhile doing.
And George?
First of all, I'd like to say, in times like this, we're all running scared like headless chickens. We're all afraid for the future. I think the last thing we should do whenever there's an economic crisis is jump to conclusions. I'm very critical of the Conservative economic policy. They say, we've had such great economic growth and recovery. Well, firstly, I'd put that down mostly to external factors, and two, it's taken them this long to get there. So I have serious doubts about their economy. I'm glad you brought up America in the 1930s, because that's a very interesting case for what I'm proposing. In the 1930s, the government of America, I think it was the 20s and led into 30s, they criminalised alcohol, losing out one of their biggest tax assets. We spend $2 billion a year criminalising cannabis. It costs more, as I said, it costs more to lock up a drug user than it does to treat them. Now, if we had a regulated cannabis market, we could put taxes on that, we could put a levy on it. It's estimated between £1 and £6 billion a year in tax revenue. Now, to put that into more perspective, Colorado in the United States, where the sale of marijuana is legal, they made so much tax money, the state government had to actually give some of it back to the distributors.
Can I say, George, I spent a lot of time in Colorado. My son lives there. I'm really looking forward to my next visit there.
Oh, you'll enjoy it. You'll enjoy yourself.
And with that, I'm going to wrap things up because you've all been extremely patient. I hope you've enjoyed the debate. I hope you've enjoyed the opportunity to listen to the candidates. I'm sorry I only had 5 rather than 6, but it did mean we were able to get through far more questions than we expected. And finally, a big thank you to the production team. They've worked all day setting this up. It's all Audlem's equipment, which they've purchased themselves, and I think they've done a tremendous job. And thank you very much indeed. And finally, a very, very big thank you to the candidates. I think it's fantastic that they've all been able to come to Audlem. They've given us their views. They haven't fought too much amongst themselves, but we've heard what the different parties represent. Thank you very much indeed.